There is a phase no one talks about because it doesn't look like growth. It looks like disappearance. The empath doesn't rise first. They retreat, not out of fear, not out of weakness, but because something inside them finally recognizes a truth that hurts more than any loss. Their sensitivity has been open, unguarded, and available for far too long, and the world has been feeding on it quietly. If you've ever wondered why the most perceptive people vanish right before their lives change, why the empath goes silent after years of giving, why connection suddenly feels expensive, this is why. The disappearance is not collapse. It's containment. The empath doesn't disappear because they're broken. They disappear because they're done leaking energy into spaces that never learned how to hold it. This withdrawal confuses people. Friends call it distance. Family calls it coldness. Others call it selfish. But none of them see what's actually happening beneath the surface. They don't see the internal shift. The moment empathy stops flowing outward automatically and begins turning inward for the first time, that moment feels lonely. It feels like loss. It feels like you're becoming someone unrecognizable. But it is the most dangerous phase of growth there is. Because when the empath disappears, they stop being readable. They stop being predictable. They stop being usable. And that's when everything changes. If this feels uncomfortably familiar, don't rush past it. Stay with this channel. Quiet power doesn't teach you how to rise loudly. It shows you why the fall was never the end. Now let's begin where the empath actually breaks long before the disappearance ever starts. The empath does not break because they are weak. They break because they stayed open in a world that rewards extraction more than reciprocity. From an early age, the empath learns to read runes before reading themselves. They sense shifts in tone, emotional undercurrents, unspoken needs. This sensitivity is not taught as a skill. It is formed as a survival mechanism. The empath adapts quickly because adaptation keeps connection intact. And connection, early on, feels like safety. Over time, this becomes identity. The empath becomes the listener, the stabilizer, the emotional translator. They learn to absorb discomfort so others don't have to feel it. They anticipate needs before they are spoken. They smooth tension. They explain emotions. They overgive clarity. And the world quietly adjusts to this offering. People come to rely on it, expect it, feed on it without realizing they are doing so. This is where the fracture begins. Not in trauma alone, but in repetition. The empath gives before being asked. They offer understanding instead of boundaries. They excuse behavior that should have been confronted. They internalize responsibility for emotional outcomes that were never theirs to manage. And each time they do this, a small portion of their internal authority dissolves. What no one tells the empath is that empathy without containment becomes self-erasure. Sensitivity without structure becomes exposure. The empath's nervous system remains constantly open, scanning for emotional signals, responding before rest is earned. There is no off switch. There is no internal perimeter. Everything is felt. Everything is processed. Everything is carried. At first, this feels meaningful. Being needed creates purpose. Being trusted creates identity. Being the one who understands creates worth. But slowly, the cost accumulates. The empath begins to feel tired in a way sleep cannot fix. Social interactions feel heavy. Silence feels safer than conversation. And still, they keep showing up because withdrawal feels like betrayal. This is the stage where confusion sets in. The empath cannot explain why they feel resentful when they are the one who offered so much. They feel guilty for needing space, ashamed for wanting distance. They wonder if something is wrong with them for no longer enjoying what once defined them. The problem is not empathy. The problem is that empathy has been flowing in one direction for too long. The world rarely teaches empaths how to receive. It teaches them how to regulate others. So when depletion arrives, they don't know how to stop. They only know how to endure. They tell themselves it's temporary, that things will balance out, that one day someone will see them the way they see everyone else. But that day rarely comes, because people adjust to access. When someone is always available, always understanding, always accommodating, the environment reorganizes around that presence. Expectations form, emotional dependency grows, and the empath becomes a quiet infrastructure holding everything together. This is where the internal split deepens. The empath begins to feel invisible while being constantly involved. They are present but unseen, needed but not known, relied upon but not protected. And slowly, a realization surfaces that is both devastating and clarifying. If they disappeared, the system would collapse, but no one would ask why they were holding it alone. That realization hurts. It dismantles the empath's core narrative, the belief that giving guarantees safety, that understanding guarantees reciprocity, that kindness guarantees care. When those beliefs crack, grief follows. Not just grief for others, but grief for the self that believed endurance would be rewarded. This is the breaking point. Not explosive, not dramatic, internal, quiet. The empath starts pulling back in small ways. They stop responding immediately. They say no without explanation. They leave earlier. They listen less. And with each boundary, guilt surfaces. Fear surfaces. The fear of becoming cold. The fear of becoming selfish. The fear of losing connection. But what is actually happening is recalibration. The empath's nervous system is searching for safety inside instead of outside. The body begins demanding containment, rest, silence, reduced exposure. And because the empath has never been taught how to do this gradually, it feels like collapse. This is when others begin to notice. They comment on the change. They ask what's wrong. They suggest the empath is distant, guarded, different. Some respond with concern, others with irritation. Very few respond with curiosity. And that response becomes another data point. Another confirmation that the empath's openness was more useful than it was valued. The empath does not disappear yet, not fully. This chapter is the internal fracture, the slow withdrawal of automatic giving. The moment empathy begins turning inward instead of outward. It is uncomfortable, disorienting, lonely, but it is necessary. Because without this break, the empath would never question the cost of their identity. They would continue offering access without consent. They would continue confusing usefulness with love. They would continue leaking energy until numbness replaced sensitivity entirely. This stage feels like loss, but it is the first moment of truth. The empath is not becoming less caring, they are becoming more contained. And containment is the prerequisite for power. The disappearance comes later. But first, the empath must break the pattern that taught them their worth was measured by how much they could carry for others. The empath does not announce their withdrawal. There is no declaration, no confrontation, no dramatic exit. What happens instead is subtle, internal, almost invisible. The empath begins conserving energy in ways that feel foreign, even dangerous to their old identity. They stop volunteering emotional labor. They stop filling silence. They stop anticipating needs that were never spoken. And because this change is quiet, it is often misinterpreted. From the outside, it looks like decline. People assume the empath is struggling, depressed, lost, or not themselves. In reality, this is the first phase of reclamation. The empath is learning something radical. Not every feeling they sense belongs to them, and not every emotional imbalance requires their intervention. This realization does not come easily. The empath has been conditioned to believe that awareness creates responsibility. If they notice discomfort, they feel compelled to resolve it. If they sense tension, they instinctively soften it. Withdrawal feels like negligence. Silence feels like cruelty. And rest feels undeserved. This conditioning creates resistance. Even as the empath pulls back, guilt floods in. Guilt is the final gatekeeper of overexposure. It is the emotion that keeps empaths accessible long after they should have stepped away. During withdrawal, guilt becomes loud. The empath hears internal accusations. You're abandoning people. You're changing. You're becoming cold. You're losing what made you special. These thoughts are not truths. They are echoes of an identity built on availability. As the empath withdraws, relationships shift. Some connections weaken. Others dissolve entirely. This can feel like proof that withdrawal is wrong. But quiet power recognizes something else happening. When empathy is no longer freely given, only relationships built on genuine reciprocity remain. Everything else falls away. This is the loneliest phase. The empath is no longer surrounded, but not yet sovereign. They have stepped out of familiar dynamics, but have not built new internal structures to replace them. There is space now, silence, unoccupied emotional territory. And for someone used to constant engagement, that space can feel unbearable. Many empaths attempt to return at this stage. They reach back out. They reopen old channels. They resume giving to relieve the discomfort of isolation. But those who continue forward experience something unexpected. In the quiet, they begin to feel themselves again, not as a function, not as a role, but as a presence. This presence is unfamiliar. Without the constant feedback of others' emotions, the empath must confront their own. Long-suppressed anger surfaces. Grief surfaces. Desire surfaces. Needs surface. These were always there, but empathy outward kept them buried. Withdrawal brings them into focus. This is where the process becomes misunderstood. From the outside, the empath appears withdrawn. From the inside, they are awakening. They are learning to distinguish between intuition and obligation, between compassion and compliance, between connection and consumption. The empath begins setting boundaries without announcing them. They limit access. They reduce availability. They respond selectively, not as punishment, but as self-preservation. This selective engagement is the foundation of quiet power. It shifts the empath from reactive to intentional. As access decreases, some people push back. They test boundaries. They express disappointment. They accuse the empath of changing. This pressure is not accidental. It is the system attempting to restore balance in its favor. Quiet power teaches the empath to observe this without reacting. Resistance is confirmation that the withdrawal is necessary. Internally, something stabilizes. The empath's nervous system begins to downregulate. Hypervigilance softens. Rest becomes possible. Clarity sharpens. For the first time, the empath notices how much energy was being spent managing external states. Without that drain, mental space opens. This space allows reflection. The empath sees past interactions more clearly. They recognize patterns they once excused. They understand how often their empathy was used to avoid accountability in others. This clarity can feel bitter, but it is also liberating. It dissolves illusion. Withdrawal is not disappearance yet. It is preparation. The empath is learning to exist without being consumed. They are discovering that connection without self-erasure is possible, but rare. And rarity is not a flaw. It is a filter. This phase requires patience. There is no immediate reward, no applause, no validation. In fact, validation often disappears entirely. The empath must learn to validate themselves, to trust internal signals over external approval. This is the hardest lesson, because empathy trains people to prioritize others' experiences over their own. As withdrawal continues, the empath becomes less readable, less predictable, less accessible. This unsettles those who relied on their transparency. But it also attracts a different kind of presence. People who respect space, who do not demand constant reassurance, who meet containment with containment. The empath is not rising yet, but they are no longer falling. They are stabilizing. They are building an internal perimeter. And within that perimeter, power begins to accumulate. The withdrawal that looked like loss was never decline. It was compression, energy pulled inward, identity shedding excess roles, sensitivity learning direction. The empath is becoming something quieter, denser, and far less exploitable. The world may not notice this change yet, but the empath does. And that awareness changes everything. After withdrawal comes a silence that is no longer empty. It is structured, intentional, alive with awareness. This is where the empath begins to change in ways that cannot be reversed. Not because they are trying to become powerful, but because power starts reorganizing itself around containment. The empath no longer explains themselves, not out of spite, but because explanation is no longer necessary. They have learned that clarity offered too freely becomes an invitation for negotiation. Silence, on the other hand, ends debates before they begin. It removes leverage. It shifts the dynamic from reactive to sovereign. This silence unsettles people. The empath used to narrate their inner world. They used to translate feelings, smooth misunderstandings, and offer reassurance. Now that transparency is gone. What remains is presence without permission, calm without accessibility. And this creates friction. Those who relied on emotional access begin projecting. They assume the empath is hiding something, withholding, punishing. In reality, an empath has simply stopped externalizing their internal process. They are no longer available for interpretation. And interpretation is how power used to be taken from them. This is where quiet power takes form. The empath becomes selective, not only with people, but with reactions. They no longer rush to respond. They pause. They observe. They allow situations to reveal themselves fully before engaging. This delay alone shifts the balance in every interaction. Power has always favored the one who does not need to rush. As silence deepens, the empath's intuition sharpens. Without constant emotional noise, signals become clearer. They can now distinguish manipulation from misunderstanding, need from entitlement, curiosity from intrusion. This discernment was always there, but it was drowned out by the obligation to respond. Now, discernment guides behavior. The empath chooses when to engage and when to withdraw further. They do not announce boundaries. They embody them. Access is no longer negotiated. It is felt. Something else begins to happen. People start adjusting around the empath instead of the empath adjusting around them. Conversations slow. Demands soften. Expectations recalibrate. This is not dominance. It is gravity. The kind that forms naturally when someone stops leaking energy. The empath is no longer easy to read. This does not make them deceptive. It makes them contained, and containment creates depth. Others sense it without understanding it. They feel that something has shifted, that the empath is no longer available for extraction. This phase can feel isolating. The empath may notice fewer messages, fewer invitations, fewer emotional disclosures from others. This is not rejection. It is filtration. Relationships that required constant emotional output fade. What remains are connections that do not feed on excess. The empath also begins to reclaim anger. Not explosive anger, but quiet, discerning anger. The kind that clarifies limits. The kind that says no internally long before words are needed. This anger was suppressed before because it threatened connection. Now it becomes a stabilizing force. With anger integrated, the empath stops absorbing blame. They no longer internalize others' discomfort. They recognize projection when it appears. And instead of correcting it, and let it sit where it belongs. Silence becomes the empath's language. Not avoidance, precision. They speak when words add value. They withdraw when presence would cost too much. This rhythm restores balance to their nervous system. Calm replaces vigilance. Choice replaces compulsion. The empath's identity begins shedding labels. They no longer define themselves by empathy alone. They see it as a tool, not a duty. Sensitivity becomes something they turn on deliberately, not something that is constantly activated. This changes how they move through the world. They walk slower, speak less, observe more. Their energy becomes grounded. People feel it immediately. Some feel drawn. Others feel exposed. The empath does not manage either response. This is the stage where old patterns attempt one last return. People test boundaries subtly. They reintroduce guilt. They reference the past. They appeal to who the empath used to be. Quiet power recognizes this as a final negotiation, and it declines without explanation. The empath does not argue with memories. They honor them privately and move forward. At this point, disappearance is no longer escape. It is strategy. The empath is no longer trying to be understood. They are focused on being intact. This is a radical shift. Because once wholeness becomes the priority, performance loses relevance. The empath understands something now. Power does not come from being seen as good. It comes from being grounded enough not to need approval. And approval was the invisible leash all along. Silence severs that leash. This silence is not emptiness. It is compression. All the empathy that once flowed outward indiscriminately is now stored, directed, available only when chosen. This makes it potent. The empath is not rising yet, but the ground beneath them has stabilized. The internal hierarchy has been restored. Self first, then others selectively. From this silence, a new presence emerges. One that does not seek connection, but allows it. One that does not fear loss, because it is no longer built on external validation. The empath has not disappeared from the world. They have disappeared from misuse. And that changes everything. The rise comes next. The rise does not arrive with momentum. It arrives with stillness. The empath does not step back into the world, announcing transformation. There is no reinvention, no performance, no explanation. What returns is not the old self strengthened, but a different structure entirely. One that no longer leaks energy, seeks validation, or negotiates its worth. This is the phase most people misunderstand because it looks uneventful. The empath does not chase opportunities. They do not correct misconceptions. They do not rush to be seen again. And yet, quietly, their life begins to reorganize around them. What has changed is internal authority. For the first time, the empath trusts their internal signals more than external reactions. They no longer ask how something appears. They ask how it feels. Not emotionally, but somatically. Does this cost energy or return it? Does this expand presence or shrink it? Does this require performance or allow authenticity? Decisions become simpler, harder, but cleaner. The empath begins choosing environments instead of adapting to them. They choose relationships based on nervous system safety, not emotional intensity. They choose work that respects rhythm instead of exploiting passion. They choose solitude without guilt and connection without obligation. This is the rise. It is quiet because it does not seek witnesses. Others notice something, though they cannot name it. The empath feels grounded, unavailable for drama, unmoved by pressure, calm in a way that is not passive. This calm is not softness, it is integration. Sensitivity anchored to structure. Awareness held inside boundaries. The empath no longer over-explains because they no longer need permission. They no longer rescue because they no longer confuse empathy with responsibility. They no longer stay where they are tolerated instead of valued, and they do not announce these changes. They simply act from them. This creates a new kind of presence, one that does not reach outward, but draws inward. People approach differently now, with more respect, more caution, sometimes with discomfort, because the empath is no longer easy to read, and unreadability removes control. This is where power stabilizes. The empath has integrated what they once rejected: detachment, selectivity, even indifference, not as defenses, but as tools. They understand now that love without limits is not virtue. It is vulnerability without protection. And protection is not hardness. It is clarity. The rise is marked by an absence. The absence of urgency. The absence of guilt. The absence of self-betrayal. Where there was once hyper-responsiveness, there is now choice. Where there was once anxiety, there is now timing. The empath begins to trust silence, to let things unfold without interference, to allow others to reveal themselves without prompting. This patience becomes an advantage. They see dynamics fully before committing. They feel consequences before stepping in. Opportunities align differently now, not louder, more precise. Invitations arrive without pursuit. Respect appears without demand. And when something does not align, the empath lets it pass without justification. This is the reward of containment. The empath's sensitivity has not diminished. It has concentrated. When they care now, it is deliberate. When they give, it is chosen. When they connect, it is mutual. This makes their presence potent, rare, felt. Some people from the past resurface. They sense the shift. They want access again. The empath recognizes this immediately. And instead of anger, there is clarity. Not everyone is meant to meet the new version. Not everyone earns proximity twice. The empath does not argue with this. They accept it. This acceptance completes the rise. There is no longer a need to be understood by those who benefited from misunderstanding. No need to revisit roles that required self-erasure. No need to prove growth to anyone watching from the old world. The empath has crossed an internal threshold. They are no longer defined by empathy alone. They are defined by discernment. And discernment is power that cannot be taken, only respected. This rise does not make the empath visible. It makes them sovereign. They move through life lighter now, not because burdens disappeared, but because they stopped carrying what was never theirs. They feel joy without explanation, peace without justification, strength without performance. The disappearance was necessary. It removed the noise. The rise simply revealed what remained, and what remained was not emptiness. It was authority, quiet, grounded, unavailable for misuse. The empath does not return to the world as they were. They return as someone who cannot be accessed without consent. And that is the biggest comeback of all. Not louder, whole. If this didn't feel like motivation, that's intentional. Real change doesn't ask for belief. It reveals itself through relief. You don't need to announce your boundaries. You don't need to explain your distance. You don't need to prove your growth to anyone who benefited from your exhaustion. If this helped you recognize where your energy belongs, stay here. This channel isn't about becoming louder, harder, or untouchable. It's about becoming unavailable for misuse, quietly.